When you're trying to figure out what artificial difficulty is, an answer most people will arrive at is that difficulty feels artificial if something is cheaply added on by the game designers. It is tempting to then hone in on the cheapness, on some speculated version of the designer's perspective, the pressure and limitations they had to operate under, their laziness, or heck, the entire work culture of cutting corners, or the lack of having a firm grasp on what makes their own game fun and functioning. That's why they elected to take the easy, the cheap route. Cheapness is certainly a factor to consider, but it isn't what makes frustrated players call something artificially difficult. We're not stung by artificial difficulty because it's cheap, but because it is added on. That's the cause of our immersion break, which yanks us out of the game world and into the designer's chair. That's the root of our indignation about the kind of means the designer apparently feels the need to employ to hold us up, and our indignation about the fact that they seem to think we wouldn't notice, or if we did, that we wouldn't mind. In my previous deep dive into what makes challenges in games fair, something I don't explicitly talk about is accessibility. However, I stress the point that challenges in games need to be made for someone to engage with them, and that they need to be designed with that someone in mind. That isn't to say I've made substantive, much less concrete points about accessibility. Rather, I'm pointing out that turning toward the topic of accessibility flows naturally from the conversation I engaged in about fairness. The definition doesn't need to be amended or temporarily retired for that purpose. In this sense, the definition is elegant. Nothing needs to be tacked on, cheaply or otherwise. That same notion of elegance is what I believe opposes artificiality in the game design department. You don't often hear elegance and talk about difficulty because it's the kind of thing you only notice once it's gone. And when that happens, people tend not to lament the loss of elegance, but to admonish artificiality. Often, when people try to define artificial difficulty, they are inclined to treat it as its own thing, as a positive, some undesirable, independent quality to be squashed. What we ought to notice, though, is that its occurrence is instead brought on by a negative, a lack thereof, namely of elegance. In his book, The Art of Game Design, Jesse Schell provides an example of an elegant game feature, the collectible dots in Pac-Man. He takes the elegance of a given game element to come down to how many different purposes it has. For Pac-Man's dots, that means they give the player a short-term goal, eat the dots close to me. They give the player a long-term goal, clear all the dots from the board. They slow the player down slightly when eating them, creating good triangularity, where it's safer to go down a corridor with no dots, riskier to go down one with dots. They give the player points, which are a measure of success, and they give the player points, which can earn them an extra life. I take the elegance of difficulty to come down to the elegance of game elements, which significantly impact the challenge. Since that comes down to an amount of purposes served by them, not how much of a challenge they pose, we can reinforce the idea that the elegance of difficulty is separate from the level of difficulty. You might object, though, that artificiality occurs when a challenge is too hard in a tacked-on way. One instance where that becomes quite pronounced is when enemies are added or copy-pasted into a fight, especially when that is done with disregard for, or straight up in defiance of, the accompanying lore, story, theme, or previous gameplay and the expectations that come with it. Difficulty goes up, effort for the game designer stays minimal. We're just tacking something on. The hopefully somewhat elegantly designed combat system is put into a context for which, in a lot of instances, it wasn't designed, or where certain options within it are suddenly no longer viable. Let's say, though, that perhaps because the designers are quite bad at their job, or simply because it was never their intention, in this instance, the lazy copy-pasting fails to significantly add to the challenge in a way where it would become too difficult. The inelegant component of having copy-pasted enemies still remains, though. Because of this, it might not make sense to speak of artificial difficulty, since apparently they aren't that involved in the challenge, but to just call that game element artificial seems justified. The point raised by the objection, that artificial difficulty only occurs when something is too hard in a tacked-on way, stands, then. At the same time, we can have artificial or inelegant design that doesn't then overinflate the level of difficulty, or have anything to do with it at all. One such instance can be found in games that over-rely on gating progression behind stat or level requirements, often combined with grinding in order to meet those requirements. Alternatively, that gatekeeper role might be served by badly implemented quests, ones that once again feel tacked on. Unimaginative fetch quests, ideally only tangentially related to the main story, like Unseasoned Veggie's gatekeeping dessert. Here, complaining about artificial difficulty would again be a bit off, but there is an abundance of artificiality around. I believe we typically refer to this as cheap design, this time triggered not by indignation, although that may be too in extreme cases, but by tedium. Though not just any tedium, dispensable tedium. Once again, something that feels tacked on after the fact, something that isn't properly integrated into core game elements. But am I not dissolving the notion of artificiality into something omnipresent and therefore a useless concept? All design is artificial, it's all crafted by the game makers. You'd be having a hard time trying to find tech trees in the wild. I don't think I'm making the mistake of dissolving artificiality. We can still refer to elegance, to the many purposes a single game feature can serve. On some level, that too is artificial, of course, but in a different sense than tacked on artificial. It is core to the intended experience. It is what other things can be tacked onto. Artificial difficulty and artificial design in general cannot be reduced to a level of difficulty. They instead consist in tacking on inelegant features in a cheap way, sometimes to increase difficulty, sometimes to prolong playtime, sometimes just to save money. The indignation or tedium this kind of design can evoke breaks us out of our immersion. It lays bare to the player what only the designer should be seeing. From the game maker's perspectives, it might on occasion make sense to bite the bullet on going with cheap artificial design. Other times, they might deem it worth to also put effort into hiding that artificiality from the player. But sometimes, there's no way around designing something elegantly from the start. However, to come up with and then actualize good, elegant design ideas is hard, just as it is hard for players, who are rightfully decrying artificial design, to correctly identify wherein exactly the inelegance consists. Alright, so video is basically over. Didn't really know how to finish it, I guess, yeah. Alright, I think that's basically all the points I wanted to make, right? No, well, there's one more I could, fit in. It's about the objection that you could make that who cares about, artificiality, defining things, whatever. You can just use the word however you feel like, right? No? Isn't that true? And to that I say, maybe, I'm really pondering it right now. It's quite interesting to me. And actually, now that I think about it, Wittgenstein talks about this in his Tracta,